Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see everybody. Well, not see, but it's really nice that you've tuned in into my talk regarding the abundance of other options that you have on the tracks. But anyways, today I will be talking about CSS resets, something that I have personally learned in a hard way while working on different sort of projects. And yeah, I guess it's going to be a good transition for you to find out a little bit about me. So my name is Margarita. I'm a full stack developer. I work in Finland. I'm currently very happy at a software consultancy called Neater. So far, the best workplace I had. So before I work in another consultancy, and before that, I work in another consultancy. Fair to say, I've been a consultant for a few years for now. For those who don't know what software consultant means, think Sherlock Holmes, right? The consulting detective. He comes on a crime scene, he helps police solve the crime cases. I do a similar thing, but with all sorts of customers. I'm a software engineer who comes on the project and helps the customer put together the system or whatever is the project that he or she really needs. I do all kinds of stuff from project setup to bug fixes to quick proof of concepts. It means also that I have encountered countless amount of CSS bugs from front-end projects, started a few projects from scratch. And an interesting thing is that throughout my entire career, it's not been JS that was a problem, really. It was not state management. It was not integrations or anything. It was little teeny tiny CSS bugs that would appear out of nowhere, that would take a reasonable amount of time to fix, rather hard to detect unless you're testing on some very specific version of a browser. And at some point I came to a sort of conclusion that maybe I should streamline it. Maybe I should somehow systematize my knowledge and try to, accumulate everything, like every little experience that I've had in one sort of bundle. And my question has always been, how do I make my life easier? How do I make starting of a project easier? How do I make a setup easier? And that philosophical search brought me into the world of CSS resets. And I dug deeper into it. I dug, and here is what I found, basically. What do we do once we create a new website, right? Like, okay, here is a new front-end project. You've been handed over a design, Figma mockups or Photoshop. There is so many ways to do it, right? First of all, there is Gatsby, there is Node.js templates, there is React.js with TypeScript, there is CSS modules, there is CSS and JS. The good news is whatever methodology, whatever technology you're really using here, it's going to apply to everything. The underlying way to do CSS resets the right way applies to pretty much every methodology to write CSS. So that's the good news. The bad news is, how do we translate that into work practice, right? How do we shift from I'm a software engineer, I just want to write code, into I want to help a designer to make a pixel perfect website? And is it a really fair thing to ask from a software engineer, from a designer, right? Like, is it a fair thing to ask for a pixel perfect website considering the amount of devices we have? Good question. Hopefully going to answer it right now. So let's try to step into the designer's shoes just for a moment and create a website for ourselves. Let's go here, and this is the Figma mockup that I have sort of concocted overnight, and nothing fancy, really, just a few things here and there. What are we going to do with it? Well, the question is, how do we translate this mockup into code, right? Let's see. Let's create CSS for this website. Let's create our designs and code it. And this is something that we're going to see very quickly. As developers, I mean, what do we do most of the time, right? We're not really concerned all that much with how the website looks in different browsers at the time when we create it. We usually just use Chrome because it's nice, it has nice developer tools. We look at it, it looks fine, and then we open it in different browsers and bam. Like, look at this gorgeousness. Not bad, right? I mean, it's still somewhat similar. There is just teeny tiny discrepancies here and there, but that's not really the biggest problem yet. Now, try to open it on mobile. Okay, well, that looks a bit more sad, right? Doesn't it? Let's talk about forms. Oh, let's not even get started on forms. So what's really the problem here? This is a tweet that describes the situation with the different browser CSS implementations very well. I think every time somebody asks why you use resets or explains that resets are too big or it's too much or if it's an overhead, show them this tweet. I mean, this describes perfectly the situation with the modern browsers nowadays. As web developers, we strive to achieve consistency, right, with the design implementation. We want to make the beautiful design our designers hand it over to us come true. We've never had so little control over the devices people view our websites on. Yet, we've never had so much control over the way we can style our websites. This is a very nice website that I've seen that describes the history of web design very well by Jeremy Thomas. It adds the design in a very subtle and small way until you can totally see how the web design has progressed over time. I really recommend you going there and checking out yourself. It's really well documenting how much things have changed ever since the 90s. And if you think about the first origin of CSS, right, that's not something that people have thought about from the beginning. HTML and CSS were supposed to be just a little bit of styling tools here and there for the pages, for the text documents. We were not expecting that there would be so much variety in web development and web design. How do we bypass that limitation is a very, very interesting question here, isn't it? Let's go here. Let's get to the bottom of it, right? Like here we have a small CodePen demo. How come we can see anything? Like how come despite there is no styles applied, there is 0 styles, we can see, and there is some sort of variety in the text we can see on the web page. What's going on? Well, the thing is, each browser, in order to display any content, has to have both HTML and CSS styling present. It's called render tree. Basically, your HTML tags and your CSS are sort of smashed together into one render tree that goes on and being displayed on the website, which means that basically with absolutely no CSS, you're going to see a blank screen because it's not going to know how to render it. To bypass that limitation, each browser has a built-in CSS, which is a part of a specification in order to implement that render tree. That's a smart move. I mean, that saves us time. We don't have to think about trivial things such as how to display text. The problem is, though, each website does it slightly differently. Let's take a look at the different browsers that do it. Like right now, there is 3 major browser engines that have each their own style sheet. There's Chromium, there is Mozilla, there is WebKit, right? Like at least 3 of them. Like how do we solve this problem in the end? Well, I've stumbled upon a very interesting piece of statistics recently on CSS Tricks when they were asking people about how they use CSS Reset. The good news is the majority, the 27%, are using some version of Eric Mayer's reset. So that's the good news. The bad news is also nearly 30% ask what is a CSS reset. So we have a very disproportionate distribution, right? There is 4% who purposefully do not use it. This is actually reason why I wanted to have this conversation about why we should in fact use it on our websites. Let's see what happens. But how do I even start, right? That's a good question. How do I even start with the resets? What do I do? Well, usually when it comes to picking a reset, this is what happens, right? Like you just Google, like, okay, what are CSS resets? How do I implement a CSS reset? So how do I download CSS reset? There's probably going to be a name Eric Mayer in there somewhere popping in the search results. And that's only fair. I mean, he's the one who pioneered the technique of CSS reset in 2004. I mean, there is nothing wrong with it, really. Like, what's the problem with just downloading it and, getting on with your day? Well, in his own words, right? In his own words, not mine, the issue is that people just chuck in any CSS reset without modification, which is bad. So, don't trust me. Don't take it from me. Take it from the creator. And what he meant by the CSS reset is that we're meant to tweak it. We're meant to adjust it to fit our own unique project in here. We're not supposed to just copy paste anything inside of our code base if you think about, doing it the right way. So let's move on and talk about how do we do that? I mean, from my 5 years of work and like countless different projects, the more prep you do before the project, the more time you save once you actually start doing the project, which means that it's going to save you potentially hours of debugging of CSS. So that's the good news. The bad news is all the CSS resets are opinionated. All resets should be tweaked. So, sorry guys, no silver bullet here. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide you the best comparison I can do to help you choose which version you're going to go with. So let's begin with the most popular universal selector hard reset. It's also sometimes called. This is something that you're going to see on CodePens quite a lot. There is also a second, a bit more advanced, in quotes, version, which is including borders and outlines. This is something that you can see right away is not a good idea. And the reason why is because you should never hard reset an outline. The first argument that I'm going to push in here as of why you shouldn't just copy paste your reset into a code base. Something that's very, basic. So if you're going to go with the most basic version, go with the first one with the margins and paddings reset. The second one is 10x Helix undo HTML reset. Not all of them, not all of the resets are going to be very popular here. Some of them are just honorable mentions here and there, and nothing wrong with that. We're going to discuss what's good and what's bad about them and why I would opt for choosing specific ones and not the others. I only managed to find the file that was back from 2004. I mean, not much has changed since then. There is the most basic reset that you can find. There is link and visited reset, which is very interesting. Like people didn't use it much at that point. It's a very minimal one. Ideally, you would want to use this in a combination with the previous one. So first you reset margins and paddings, and then you go with resetting other stuff like borders and font styles. So that's one way to do it. the mini reset. This is my second favorite smallest reset that you can find. As you're going to find out very quickly, these files are progressively bigger, and for a very good reason. Some of them involve less tweaks, some of them involve more. Yet another one, this library seems to be well maintained on GitHub. So if you want to include something minimal and that just does the job, go for it. Resets paddings and margins, resets fonts, sets list styles. Don't say anything wrong. Would totally recommend. Eric Mayer's reset is actually number 4 here. Well, size-wise at least. This is the old version, the one that he has already published in 2004. He himself strongly suggests playing around and adjusting the reset to cater to your needs. So with that being said, quintessentially, if we try to upgrade the previous reset styles, we will get to something like that. A bit of an improvement over the Eric Mayer's reset was the HTML5 Doctor. This is the one that I'm personally using and I would personally continue using for my projects. You're going to see very quickly that there is not all that much difference between this reset and Eric Mayer's reset, except for they have fixed certain outdated tags, which is great. So you wouldn't need those tags anyway, so I have it and flood your style sheets. Added a few changes here and there to fix for the browsers. And this is why I'm talking about, going with the time, going with the version that's newer, because you have better options, pretty much. The next one, the honorable mention of the Yahoo reset. It hasn't been popular, really, at least not all that much. Not that I would use it. And the reason why is because it's extremely opinionated. It resets the colors. Not sure if that's a good idea after all, but something to point out, as I mentioned, doesn't hurt anyone. Css also was a reset at one point in time. Why I would not use it is because of the important tags. Something, yes, of course, font as a tag is outdated and everything, yet still. This brings me to the point of why you should never just copy paste stuff from the internet. So yeah, we've gone so far. We got from the resets to normalization. This is very interesting. I've been saying some articles that basically pat people who use resets versus people who use normalize. I don't know. That's really just rumor in here. They're not enemies, the resets and normalization. They're more like BFFs. They're supposed to go together. Let me show you in the actual demonstration here. So I have found this amazing code pen that I really am encouraging you to explore. We have a browser, right now it's Bootstrap, but we have a browser default view, right? Nothing fancy here. We're going to switch to Mayer reset and we're going to see how it has reset the files. And we're going to switch to normalize. So what's the biggest difference between the Mayer reset and normalize? Well, as you probably can see, the difference is in the way the page has been restyled. If Mayer's reset just sort of set to the default values, whatever those are, normalize, smooth out the styles of your web page, and that's done on purpose. I mean, to be really honest, it's quite hard to come up with really good default values for the reset. And normalization has tackled that problem, but basically just reading the docs and saying, okay, well, everything should just be, the way it's in the official docs. And we're just gonna, reset the default yet again to make sure that every browser has the same default. And your goal is not to disable styles, but rather to make sure it looks kind of the same. Normalized CSS is basically the library that pioneered that approach. It's widely adopted by all of those great company names, so I guess it must be good. Though it's bulkier, like way much bulkier than the normal resets. The resets were tiny and cute, and the normalized is quite specific. The good news is, though, it's extremely well maintained on GitHub, and pretty much every line is justified and explained. And you can tweak it to your liking quite easily. So that's a good one. I would use it. The next one is Sanitize. So if we previously have been talking about Eric Mayer's reset and HTML5 reset, then the Sanitized Css is an improvement upon Normalized Css. Basically, a person who created it took Normalized, added a bunch of fixes that he wanted to add, and published it. This is the one I also use personally, so something I would definitely recommend. And it's even bigger. Let's take a look at the comparison. Right, like this is normalized versus sanitized, and it has a lot of more options. And I mean, for a very good reason, it provides a lot of fixes to the common browser issues. It's going to save you a lot of time, in hindsight. The next one is Reboot Css. It's built on top of normalized, on top of sanitized, and if you're using Bootstrap, you're already using Reboot Css under the hood because that's their default reset that comes with Bootstrap. The great news is it's as well documented as everything else and has just as much explanations and styles, and tweaking it would be a great thing to do for your project depending on your needs. Another one, which is quite interesting, it sort of combines both reset and normalize and publishes it. And that's basically what happens. There is a combination of reset and normalize, and this is what it's going to look like compared to the other one. It's more of a hard reset type of libraries. If you're building a very creative website, this is what I would choose. Something that just like resets everything, where you are going to write every style in a customary way anyway. That's a good one. Another honorable mention would be CSS Remedy. It's a project that is trying to bring every single style sheet together. I recommend checking out on GitHub and looking at the activity monitor because currently I don't think there is a lot of progress going on, but I think if we do contribute and if we do try to push it forward, that could be an amazing thing to do. Okay. Great. So now that we know it, right? Now that we've got it, what are we going to do about it? Good question. First of all, start using CSS resets in your project. The interesting point is if you're going to use them, it's much better to use them in the beginning of your project, not to discourage you to readopt your CSS, but still, if you're going to introduce a reset post-mortem when the project is already running, you're going to ruin a lot of your CSS. And if you're going to do it anyways, you might as well use visual regression testing tools because these ones are going to be amazing. Yeah. Question is, where should we even begin? Where do we begin introducing CSS into our projects? Where do we begin figuring out how all of this should work? Well, the first option, the easiest one, would definitely be, try to use ready-made resets. Try to use the combination that works well for you. Try to use the combination that is supposedly good for your website. If you're doing something that is very text heavy, well, I definitely recommend you to use normalizations because it's just going to style the text in a way that you want. If you're going to be using something like Bootstrap or Foundation as a framework, well, chances are you already have a reset integrated in there. So you don't really have to worry much about the amount of reset that you're going to put in here. First thing that I would do in order to debug your project properly would be to see whether you're using something like Bootstrap or Foundation or Ionic or Material Design. And if you do, there is probably already a reset. If you don't, though, I would recommend you revisit the one that you just downloaded from the internet. Look at it, assess it, see what breaks, try to tweak it. There is also an option to use both in conjunction. Personally, I use HTML5 Doctor and Sanitized Css together in conjunction. What I do is first I include Sanitized and put HTML5 Doctor on top of it. That's one way to go. Make sure that you really see the way your website looks with just the reset. Also, a very good point would be download your reset file separately from your main style sheet, especially if you're doing CSS and JS, especially if you're doing one of those techniques that renders CSS in browser, because then you don't have this blank screen effect happening. It's already styled in there somewhere. So yeah, those things are quite specific and important for you to know in order to set up a project properly. And yet again, ask yourself, how much do you need? If you're going for something that's very creative, very design heavy, it's probably better for you to use Reset. If you're going for something that's more text heavy and information heavy, I would say Normalized is pretty good. Create a custom reset. I mean, there is always an option to create a custom reset, really. The question is, what are the purposes and how much time are you planning to spend on it, right? It's a very good question of why would you need a custom reset in the first place? I tried. Personally, I have tried to create a custom reset in back in the days, and I would say that I failed on many accounts. And maybe this is actually a good moment to share a couple of epic fails with you guys. So one of them was using an empty pseudo class here and display none. I was reading about the empty pseudo class and how it can prevent you from, having your text with flooded empty paragraph tags, which was interesting. And I included this in my custom reset right away. And well, if you want to have an easy way to hide all of your images, all of your HR tags, and spend an hour to figure out why, that's the way to go. Another epic fail that I've had was basically including this as a base of my CSS resets, specifically because of the outline. It prevents people from accessing it in a very easy way. Something that not should be done. Outline should be customary. It should never be like hard reset. Epic fail number 3, setting both HTML and body text to overflow X hidden, because it creates really weird, bumpy, sort of funky type of a scroll effect that's very hard to understand why until you disable it. Like a way better way would be just to include overflow X for the body and go with it. So yeah, this is a little bit of a demonstration that I would like to showcase to you in here of what sort of a reset technique I'm using on a daily basis on my project. This is just text, and a lot of the websites that I'm dealing with has a lot of textual information. So let's take a look at what I'm doing for a small custom reset. I always set the base font. So in this case, the base font is going to be 16 pixels. There is always going to be a body overflow hidden to prevent pictures and other assets from, over scrolling top of it. Then there is going to be an interesting one. There is going to be sort of an advanced version of Universal Selector Reset. There is going to be margin 0, padding 0, border 0. The position of everything is by default relative, which is very important when it comes to that index. If position is not explicitly specified, that index might be tricky to master. So that one. Box sizing to border box to make sure that neither extra margins or paddings are affecting the layout. Font size to 1 EM. Remember the default with font size? Well, that's the default to this one. It's much easier to change this one variable on top than all of those in here. The font weight to 400 and the font style to normal. There is a very good reason to do this, and the reason is very often browsers such as Chrome and Safari make text by default bolder, and that's not the effect that we would definitely want to achieve. Color, black, well, for obvious reason. This one is quite interesting. This combination, I would probably even call it like the mini font reset combination, because once you work with text, it's quite hard to, figure out the right way to adjust fonts on different browsers. So yeah, this is something that I'm doing, and as you can see, the text, it breathes right away, right? We don't need to be bothered with anything else here. And the final touch is going to be setting paragraph width to 33 AM. And the reason why I'm doing it, and this is the wrong one actually, we need to set the maximum width to 33 AM. And the reason why we're doing it is because of the readability. I've been reading a very interesting research about the readability of the text, and the optimal width of the text for it to be readable will be 33 of the font size. So yeah, there we go. This is something that I'm doing just right away, almost religiously on my projects, and it sort of works. If there is something that you're going to take out of this talk, I guess, is that don't be afraid of experimenting, try different ways to do the reset, and just enjoy the process. Try to find the way that works for you on the website. Thank you, guys.
Nice. I suppose it's time for questions. Is it right?
Yeah. Please ask me any questions. I'll be happy to answer.
Nice. I have a few one. And first is next. You've mentioned that first thing you do when you enter a new project as a consultant, you check if any reset CSS or normalized CSS is applied. And here I wonder if there was a mistake and none of them was applied from the very beginning. Is it possible to fix that issue? I mean, all the website was developed without any reset or normalizer. Is it possible to add it in a good way?
Well, there is no not painful way to add it. Like, unfortunately, the problem is it depends, of course, on the project maturity and the complexity of the design. That's the first thing. If we're talking about a website that pretty much has only text, and like think of Medium, right? It's very text heavy. There is not all that much bells and whistles going on. That's easier because the changes, if they're there, they're going to be very visible right away. If we're talking about a website that is a big system with pretty much hundreds of pages and links and something that uses reusable components, that's going to be a painful thing to fix because there is a lot of things that can go wrong here and there in unexpected places and different browsers as you apply. So think about this is pretty much a factorial, right? The amount of pages multiplied by amount of components multiplied by amount of browsers and devices where things can go wrong. If that's the case, if you need to, if you want to update it, of course, I would love to encourage you, but I would like you to use some sort of a visual regression testing tool first, something that can sort of automatically take the snapshot of your website before and after the change and like see what broke, because that's not productive to do manually, like at all.
Okay, it's clear that it's painful process, and in that case, does it worth to do that? I mean, you discovered that some project, which is probably already in production, doesn't use Reset CSS, and for sure it's a problem, and we know that it's not that easy to apply it. Does it worth it? Or we
Is it worth it? That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, actually. Well, yes and no. It's a very philosophical question of the time and effort, and it's a very situational question, because in order to like answer it in a good way, like you would need to see the code base, right? I would say if the project is very, very, very mature, it might not be really worth it. If that's the example of the first one, that's a lot of pages, lots of components, lots of different devices, and it might be worth it to just integrate pieces from different resets little by little into the components. So what you're going to do, instead of just having it as a base for everything, you're going to be copy pasting things for the specific tags little by little into a code base, and that would be the way to actually fix it in a less painful way, because there's just going to be one component to fix at a time. So yeah, that would be an approach that I would probably choose.
Thanks. Here I want to mix a question from our audience. Sorry, it's pretty long. I will read it aloud. What do you think about pixel perfect implementation of design consistent across supported browsers? We have font rendering differences in browsers and operation systems, which makes it impossible, in fact. On the other hand, we can just fix anything that is totally out of hand and leave it be, not as beautiful as design, but functional. I suppose it's related to your example from the very beginning of your presentation.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. I'm really happy with the quality of the questions that I'm getting. Like here, okay. So the thing is, I'm not really sure how realistic it is to require pixel perfect design because of the amount of variation of devices on orientations. Like pixel perfect design would presume that the designer has handed over like all of those designs to you, right? Like for every single like variation of a device. So that is a very good question, like how much time the designer does have. There is a very good article that I've stumbled upon at some point that basically instead of sizes, think about orientation. So the philosophy of the article was think about the orientation of the elements on your web page as opposed to having your website pixel perfect, because there is going to be variations, here and there from the tiniest one to the biggest one, right? So I would say think about the orientation, think about how they're going to resize, right? If the screen is going to be slightly bigger, what's going to stretch? The cards or the background? If the text is going to stretch, where is it going to go? In the middle or to the right or to the left? Those type of cases. The orientation is usually more important from that perspective than the following exactly the pixel by pixel implementation.
I see. So it depends on time and money as usual.
Well, that's not really the case, though. That's not really the case, though. No, it depends on like how professional the designer is. Like it's very easy to blame the software engineer on not having something pixel perfect on the website, but from my perspective, a good designer understands that like pixel perfectness is not an attainable goal, and there has to be a variation. There has to be a room to make those variations to adjust your design to the devices. A good designer can communicate those, but they don't always understand it, unfortunately, because a lot of them come from graphic design, which is static, right? Nothing resizes, you just made a poster. So in a sense, that is my philosophy. It has to be a collaboration. Like if you see that design is very static, you might as well just sit with a designer down and like, okay, it's gonna resize. There is just no way for me to make exactly the same pixelation on every single device. Let's see how we can work with orientation and what can stretch and what can move here and what's the main focus.
Thanks. Next question is probably more practical. Let's imagine that I am a newbie, or maybe even not newbie, but a skilled developer, but from some other area, for example, backend developer. And after your talk, I understand that yes, we need some kind of restyling for our browser. It doesn't matter if it's Normalizer or Reset. And as you've mentioned, a lot of decisions which are applied to those various options, they are opinionated. So you mentioned probably over 10 different options, and for sure each of them is well documented, and you can find comments which explain why do we have this or that line. So let's imagine that I'm a backend developer and I see that variety. What should I choose? Because I can find something common across all that reset files, but also they have different opinions for some tricky moments. And as soon as I'm not skilled enough in CSS, I can't judge by myself what is better. I should trust to someone. Should I choose something? Should I pick only those parts which I definitely understand, or should I trust to something is most popular? What is your opinion?
That's an excellent question. Well, first of all, not every single library that I have set as an example in my presentation is well documented. That is one of the biggest issues here, because a lot of them are not really all that well documented. Unfortunately, that's the case. And I think one of the biggest problems is that, like, out of all of those abundances, right? Like, there's so many. I would probably personally choose like HTML5 Doctor, Normalized, Sanitized, Reboot, maybe destyle if you need like a hard reset, and maybe like the mini reset version. So these are just a few ones out of a huge amount. If you're a newbie and if you are like just starting a website, you have a huge advantage in a sense, because first of all, by looking at the documentation of something like Reboot or Sanitize, you can pretty much easier understand what's going on, what are the main like bottlenecks of CSS design. So this is actually gonna help you to learn faster, as interestingly as it sounds. I definitely recommend you picking the ones that are trusted. So Normalize, Sanitize, Reboot, Mini Reset, HTML5 Doctor, because those are the good examples. Like, look for the ones that have explanations as to why they do what they do. If you're gonna start a project, like as I said, define the goal. Like, I'm not saying that every single project like ever is gonna need CSS reset, right? Like, but define like how little reset you want, and then go from there. If you're like very, very new, I guess maybe even something like Sanitize is gonna help, because it provides such a good like starting base that you're gonna have to write very little on top of it.
I see. Okay, next question is from a little bit another angle. First of all, I remember that when first Reset CSS from Mayer appears, it was more than 15 years ago. We still have IE and so on, and it was really critical to have that reset files. But nowadays, all major browsers, they are much more similar. And is it still valid point to have something like that? I know you presented some examples, and for sure we have a higher variety on mobile devices, but still modern browsers, they are much more consistent in this way. Do you think that it is possible that sometime in, I don't know, 5 years, let's imagine, they will be so similar that we don't need that files?
I hope so. Like, I hope so that in 5 years they're going to be just the same, and I'm not going to have to, have all of those monstrosity of testing and include the files. That's definitely one of the positive hopes that I have for the future of browsers. CSS Remedy actually does it, sort of tries to fix the issue. Personally, I think that what a lot of them do, especially the normalization ones, they don't just make it look the same, they also fix specific bugs here and there. Especially, don't think about the people like us. The screenshots that I took from my updated versions of browsers yesterday. Think about people who don't update their browser for like 5 years on like very cheap devices somewhere in India. Right? That's the niche no one really thinks about. You want to make sure it looks good in those as well, or at least readable. Okay, like let's not get overly optimistic here. Not good, but readable as your website and accessible to the users. That's the concern that we have. That is, I guess, more important than this. Of course, like there is always a counter argument to pretty much everything. You can always say, yeah, it's good enough. Maybe for your case, I guess.
Next question is kind of continuation of previous one. First of all, I want to ask about fixing bugs. Don't you think that fixing bugs should be on browser side? I mean, at least in JavaScript world, we have that official opinion from engine developers, which says, do not optimize your code for our engines. Write your code as you do, and let us to optimize our engines for your code. So why shouldn't we follow the same approach in CSS?
Because updates in browsers, they come very slowly. I don't know, like there is no guarantee, like in 5 years it's going to be all that different. I hope so, but there is no guarantee, and you need your stuff to look good today. Don't you? It's a very good philosophical question. Like, I'm really happy with the questions I'm getting here, because it sort of forces me to think about, meaning of life and universe and philosophy. But the truth is, depends on your approach to making software. My approach is, make it look somewhat good now, and if browsers fix it later, great. If you don't want to think about it, that's a fair point. Don't think about it.
Yes, that's fair. Okay, I will continue. And first Reset CSS appears more than 15 years ago. And I did some small research before our today talk. And as far as I understand, 15 or even 20 years ago, the default styles applied to a web page by browser was just 20 or 30 lines of code. And nowadays it's around 1,000. Is it right?
I don't know.
I mean,
I haven't really calculated.
I mean, the default styles becomes more complex through the time, at least.
Well, yeah,
as
that's
far as
true.
I understand.
I think that's true.
But
I think that's good.
and same time, so browsers, they make the default styles more complex, and same time developers have to make their reset CSS files also more complex to reset that new complexity from browsers. It sounds like a war while we should be a friends. What's going on?
Well, it's not as dramatic as it sounds, because it's not like there were 30 lines and now there is 1,000. Really, it's less than 1,000, like way less than 1,000. Really, the truth is, what browsers want to do is to provide as much of a good user experience out of the box. There's nothing wrong with using like default browser properties. Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, even in JS world, like if you can use native functionality, if you can invoke like native browser like functions for, I don't know, your forms or for clicks, do it, because that's like free code for you, right? But the question is not really, it's not about us being in a war. It's about creating like a clean slate to build your styles on top of it. You might not need it. Like, I sound like Dan Abramov right now. Like, you might not need Redux, but you might not need CSS Reset. But the truth is that that's the point. Like, you might not need it if you think that the default functionality, the default styles that your browser provide are good enough for you. If there is nothing critical, don't include it. If it's, on the other hand, a very fancy website, there is a big probability that by not uniforming your styles, something is just going to be, I don't know, it's just going to be hidden. You're just not going to be able to see it, like in the first place, because, I don't know, some margins and paddings collapsed in there somewhere. So that's different. Yeah, I'm pretty much arriving to the same point in circles. Think before you include anything. Read the docs, see what you need, and repeating it like a good mom.
I see. And what about the performance issue here? Just because, as far as I understand, the way CSS object model works, the more styles we have on a page, the slower it works. I understand that we are talking about milliseconds or even decimals of milliseconds, but still. So we have some lines of default browser styles, we have some lines of reset CSS, and we have a few milliards of page loading daily. And each time we have that milliseconds probably, but we can multiply them to a few millions per, I don't know, hour and so on. So it just hits the planet and around. Why can't we just have some flag on HTML tag which says, browser, come on, I know what I want. Please do not apply any default styles at all.
That would be actually an excellent situation. Like, if we could do that, that would be like a very good way to do it. But I don't think we're able to do it for a very good reason, because of how the graphic card works and how the render tree works. The truth is, that's a very big myth that I'm going to be happy to dispel right in here, because there is this huge myth about like that CSS resets are just adding too much on top of already existing functionality. It's too much CSS. It flaws the page. Well, the truth is, it's not the case. The truth is, if it's done the right way, if it's done from the beginning, it actually reduces the amount of custom CSS that you need to write later. Like, see what I did here. right?
Yep.
Like it actually reduces the amount of fixes you need to do later in your CSS because it's already uniformed. So in a sense, it actually does save space. And also, as I mentioned already, it should not be really included in the same CSS bundle. It should be included like separately as a separate link. It could be minified. And it really does not seem like a problem to me. I mean, CSS overload performance is like, maybe it used to be a problem like 10 years ago. It's definitely not a problem right now.
So your philosophy is the better you prepare your background, the more efforts you save during a long way. Is it right?
That is pretty much my philosophy, yes.
Okay. That's really close to me. We have one more question from audience, and it's related to last question about adding Reset CSS to existing project. You've mentioned that visual regression testing is a really helpful tool, and the question is, are there any tips about integrating that visual regression testing if we don't have it on a project?
Well, there is many tools. Like I would recommend you to use a tool and not to set it up yourself. Like the only reason I would see for you to set it up yourself is if you needed something very specific and customary. But that's usually not the case. So I, first of all, regarding this type of testing, yes, I use it from the tool, from some online platform. Don't spend too much time setting it up yourself because I've tried. And it was long and it was painful and it was not worth the effort. So that would be the one thing. Another thing, it's really helpful when you do a lot of things, not just for the reset. It's helpful when you do rebranding or redesign. Even for changing, like, I don't know, even for changing like the margin from 3 pixels to 5 pixels can be detected by visual regression testing, and you can easily see if it broke anywhere. So yeah, that's my 5 cents, I guess. Not a specific tool that I could recommend right now from the top of my head, but definitely Google it.
Should we care about cross-browser visual regression? I mean, should I care about browser stack, or using just Chrome is enough? I suppose the second option is not true, just because we are discussing problems between different browsers, across browsers, but still.
No, but I can see the point of the question. Well, that's usually what happens. I mean, that's usually what happens when you develop. You just develop it in one browser and, okay, it looks good here. And then you see all sorts of strange behavior once you switch from, like, even Chrome to Firefox. Like, I've had a strange flags box bug like a month ago where I couldn't understand why the images were squashed. So, like, yeah, and flags box is not all that new. You know, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I guess it could be a very good tool to use browser stack. I use browser stack though not for visual regression testing because that's manual. I use it when there is need to solve a specific bug from a bug report. Like, okay, like on this device something broke and I try to reproduce it. But for visual regression testing there is different tools.
I see. About visual regression, do you think it's fine to keep all those images in same Git repo with source code?
You don't need all of the images. You don't need to keep them. The point of using a tool is that you don't have to flood your own code with images and snapshots.
But you need some version to compare.
Yeah, and that's something that a tool can do. take the snapshots in the beginning and then just compare those to those. That's not something that you need to do manually. You don't have to produce your own images, because that's what a good tool is supposed to do for you. The truth is, a lot of those things are very tricky to do, because before you do any of those, you need to have a plan. Before you start doing the visual regression testing, for example, you might not want to do it in the beginning of the project when you're just writing your CSS, for instance, because that's not useful. Visual regression testing becomes useful once your project has reached the point of maturity, when you're fixing stuff, not adding new stuff. Another point would be that you might also use tools such as Storybook or Style Guidist or other stuff to make sure that your visual components are isolated. In that sense, it's going to be easier to make snapshots, because you're going to effectively do the snapshots of your components and not the pages. Although that actually also is true, so that your pages might not work together with all of those components combined, but that's another story. So yeah, there was so many details that coming into it that you really want to have a plan. Like, I guess like one outtake would be that, okay, get a design, devise a plan about how you would like to scale the website. Like, what is the orientation? Like, what can I stretch? Like, go to your designer and ask, can I touch your stuff? Like, what can I stretch? Which element should go where? That would be the first step. Another step would be to provide a clean slate depending on your taste, I guess. Another step would be to establish establish 3 main devices. Like, right, you're probably going to have target audience for your product or website anyway. So establish 3 main devices, or like 3 main browsers, and test your web application in those in the beginning. After that has happened, if you're doing it the right way, separating the UI components, then you can do the snapshotting of those components in isolation. And that just becomes glorious. Then you don't really have to worry about firefighting the pods post-mortem.
I see, thanks. During your talk, again, you mentioned that checking file is one of the first steps when you join a new project. Can you share a few more steps?
Well, depending on the project, sure. Sure. So, well, it depends on the project, but I guess we're talking CSS right now, like nothing else, because the types of projects are quite different. But CSS-wise, I check what's the methodology, because there can be, plain CSS, Sass, CSS and JS, whatever. I'm looking at how well organized the files are, whether they are logically separated, whether they're using some sort of methodology such as BAM or like any other naming conventions. If it's CSS modules, for instance, you don't really have to follow the naming convention, yet you still want to use variables instead of, for example, I don't know, just copy pasting the same stuff again and again in the code. Then I'm trying to basically abstract the styles as much as possible, meaning that separate things into reusable components as much as possible. There is also this part when I'm trying to view it on iOS Safari, because that's the browser I always use. I haven't really updated my iPhone to be used with Chrome. And I intrinsically believe that a good developer should be able to make a website on mobile Safari work. So there's that. So yeah, there is a lot of steps that I do, but checking the reset type is a big one. It usually explains a lot of bugs. or why you're trying to solve certain bugs, rather like that.
Thanks. I see one more question from the audience. It's about why do you use relative for everything in your preset? As far as I remember from your explanation, it's to fix that index issues which might appear in case you do not set the position directly, but maybe there are some other reasons, and maybe you know what kind of problems that might cause.
I don't see any problems that can be caused by position relative, or at least, let's put it this way, I have not bumped into them yet. But the truth is, I think that it's easier to set it because it really solves a lot of headache about which is relative to what. Like usually, right, when you're writing it, you usually don't think about, this is relative. It's usually the default version. But then you add like all of those that are absolute or fixed. These are the exceptional parts. So once everything is relative, those that are absolute to the relative parent. And since everything is relative, the nearest parent of that absolute element is going to be relative, and it's not going to cause any absolute positioning issues. Oh my God, this is such a complex way to explain this, but I wish I could just show the code. But yeah, that's my point. Just hear it a few times in the record and understand what I'm talking about.
Thanks. And about those complex questions, can you recommend some, talks, articles? I understand that this question is probably more for offline when you have some time to prepare, but still, maybe you can point to some materials it was to learn to understand better the problem.
Well, I wrote a blog post at some point based on that explains the notion of reset even in more detail. So if I could probably recommend something, and then there is also reference at the bottom as a bonus. So if I could recommend a blog post, that would probably be mine. It's named the same way as my presentation. So
that one on Medium, right?
Yeah.
I suppose. Nice. And probably one of the last questions is next. It's not related to your main topic, but it's just related to the fact that you are a consultant. And I wonder, what is the difference between regular developer and consultant? From my point of view, you need more broader view to different technologies. But same moment, I'm as a person who dealt with consultants, I actually suppose that at least some of them are person that can come and say, well, you need to do your job better, and to provide some examples, but any even bad decision on a project usually caused by some reasons. And as a consultant, you most probably don't know those reasons. So can you please advertise if it was to switch to being consultant, or if it is not, what is your opinion and how you can compare with regular software development?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a very good approach to just come on a project and say everything is bad. That's a bad decision because, well, you put it in a very good way. Whoever asked the question, you put it in a really good way that, it's very easy to criticize, but you don't really know the historical reasons, right? Like how the project was created. There are POCs, proof of concepts, that I'm not personally proud of, and a lot of people would look at the code and say, "Oh my God, this is so bad." But the truth is, I created it out of bricks and duct tape somewhere, within the span of 3 days, to just show that this stuff can work like that. In many ways, on software projects, things happen very fast, and sometimes you need to compromise quality to reach a certain goal. Like, I'm not this type of a consultant. Like, at least I try to believe that I'm not this type of a consultant who would just come and trash everything. I'm trying to be very like understanding and diplomatic when it comes to dealing with projects. And like my philosophy is sort of like being brought into masses for that specific reason. Like, that's what I know so far. You know, it's questionable, but that's something that I think I might know. So yeah, that's the thing. I think I wouldn't advertise it necessarily, but I wouldn't say it's a bad job. It really depends on your preferences. I love changing projects. So that's the perk of being a consultant. It's easy to change a project. If you're working as an in-house developer, well, I guess you have less of an opportunity to do so. So yeah.
Nice. I see that we are almost out of time, and I hope that I haven't missed any question from our audience. But in case guys, you have any other question, you can join us at a discussion zone in Zoom. And Margarita, thanks a lot for your time and for your talk. I hope to see you in a few minutes in our discussion zone.
Thank you so much. The questions were excellent.
Yeah, hello everybody. How are you feeling after this long session? Vasily did a great job. Like, what I can say, like, he asked so many questions. Like, it's really like, I don't know how to say it. It's like impressive. Margarita, thank you very much for your talk. Unfortunately, I'm not fully understood it since I was doing some other stuff. That's the issue. I haven't fully listened to you, unfortunately.
No worries.
Okay, so guys, you're going to the Zoom. Right below the Vasily, there is a link to the Zoom. As you can see, again on the left of me, so down there the link to the Zoom. I hope that there will be more questions from the audience there, because during the talk there were not so many questions. This means that your talk, Margarita, was very good positioned, because like there are no questions almost. So you did a great job.
Thank you.
You did a great job.
That's really nice to hear.
Okay, yeah, and with the vote, your talk is 100% amazing.
Oh wow, that's actually great news.
Yeah, so you have like ordinary, decent, and amazing, and it's 100% amazing. So not so many people voted, but like everybody who voted very liked your talk. Okay, so I will no longer like torture you in this session. So good luck and thank you very much. I hope that you will have a good Zoom conference afterwards.
Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, everybody. Bye.